And welcome to another off-season edition of Spits and Suds. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. I'm Gavin Spittle of 105.3 The Fan. I saw this review that came up on my timeline last night. Truly appreciated. Wanted to read it real quick. Curry Up Awesome says, awesome, 5 stars. Gavin makes a serious effort to cover anything and everything Dallas Stars. It's my go-to pod before and after games. The guests are always impressive and knowledgeable, too. Super awesome job. 5 Frosties for me. Woo, I like that. Cracking 5 in a row. Wow. That would make for some serious Stars conversation if that was the case. So if you get a chance, leave a review. It helps us. Thank you so much. Truly appreciate it. Curry Up Awesome. So one of the things that I wanted to do as we get you ready for training camp is to take you behind enemy lines, so to speak, getting a perspective on the Stars and their own team from our Central Division foes. So as I just said, Curry Up Awesome says the guests are always impressive and knowledgeable. High expectations for our next guest to deliver on. He is the voice of the Minnesota Wild. It's Joe O'Donnell. How are you, buddy?
A little bit of pressure, maybe a lot of bit of pressure after that review. But I agree. You guys do a great job, Gavin. I'm impressed with how you built this thing up, my friend. And
thank you.
Try not to let you down.
Okay, so, before we get into hockey, storm in Minnesota last night, you were just telling me. Power went out. I thought when you made it to become the voice of the Minnesota Wild, someone else would come into your yard and pick up branches.
Yeah, I wish. My wife and I are just out there in the driveway. We came back after 3 weeks of being out on the East Coast, seeing family and friends, spending time at the beach, to a refrigerator that had just essentially stopped working while we were gone. You can imagine how that smelled. That was after 17 hours in the car over 2 days. That was fun to come back to with the kids and our dog. And now we had a huge storm last night. Power's going to be out for like at least 24 hours, cleaning up branches. Yeah, everything's great. I'm glad it's not hockey season yet because it gives me time to do this stuff.
Absolutely. Okay, when does training camp start for the Wild?
Top of my head, the 18th of September, I think, is either medicals or the first day on the ice. The first game, I know that much, is the 21st because I got to be on the air for that. So that's go time in the radio world. And I think it's in Dallas, actually, one of those first games.
Nice.
Against the Stars. So I think our first one's in Winnipeg, and then over that next weekend we go to Dallas. So I think it's home and home with Winnipeg, Dallas, and Chicago this year are the 6 games. Lost that Colorado preseason trip, which you will never catch me complaining about. As much as I like Denver, that's a brutal day trip.
Yeah.
With the time change, the 45 minutes from the airport to the rink. So to go morning of and come back, that's just a long day. So I'm not too upset that the Wild dropped that one from their preseason schedule, but it'll be here before you know it. Some high expectations for some players internally on the Wild roster to have better seasons. And I think that's kind of what they're banking on to try and get back in the playoffs after missing for just a second time in like the last dozen years or so.
Well, one of the things Stars will find your perspective so interesting on is you have had a very long relationship with Matt Dumba going back to your days of calling the Houston Aeros. Tell us what the Stars are getting in Matt Dumba.
Well, I'll start off the ice because as much as Stars fans are going to care about on the ice, off the ice with Matt Dumba is just as important. He is a great figure in the community. You will see him take a large role, I would believe, in that Stars locker room. Now, look, when Matt Dumba came up through the Wild system, he was kind of a homegrown talent, right? Drafted in the first round, as you said, time in the minors, and then NHL star. And so he was able to sort of grow in that locker room. So I'm not saying from day one he'll be a leader in that room, but as far as personality, energy, compete level every night, you're going to get that from Matt Dumba. As I said, just a great person to have in the community from an initiative standpoint, a nonprofit standpoint. He ran a Hockey Without Limits camp here for basically underprivileged kids that had never played before. So that was a really cool endeavor that he took on head on. And then on the ice, you're going to get a booming shot, a guy that can skate. He's always looking for the big hit. He was much maligned at times by the Wild fan base. He didn't have a super year in Arizona, kind of signed late, 1 year prove it deal, if you will, after that long contract with Minnesota. But look, the Wild would have loved to have kept him 2 summers ago. They just didn't have cap space.
Yeah.
So, that he was strictly a cap casualty, I think. But a right shot D man that can move. There's not a ton of them in the NHL. It's not too old. I wouldn't say like he's on the downside of his career. I just think Arizona's, they were what they were last year. I expect Matt Dumba to have a better season with a good group of players around him, a team that's competing for Stanley Cup. And obviously, his experience will go a long way to helping the Stars.
So you feel as though he still can be a top 4 D-man in this league?
Maybe not. I don't know if maybe because Dallas is so deep. I don't know that he's a top 4 guy for the Stars, but I just think that just speaks to their depth and probably just explains why they're going to be a Stanley Cup contender again. I think honestly, he can play top 4 minutes, but he's probably better at this point in his career, a little bit more sheltered minutes, and just know you're going to get some offense from him because of his shot and because of his mobility. There will be some mistakes with Matt Dumba, sometimes aggressive mistakes, but as long as he's moving his feet and engaged physically, I think Dallas Stars fans, again, there'll be some lumps, there'll be some moments where like, oh, what the heck was he thinking? But his energy, his leadership, his experience, I think it'll go a long way to helping an already deep Dallas Stars blue line.
You talked about seeing some of the people stepping up. Big long-term contract in this offseason for defenseman Brock Faber.
Yeah. Well, again, essentially replaced Matt Dumba last year. And expectations were whatever, right? He's a rookie. He got in a couple of games 2 years ago, and then that playoff series against Dallas, and that was all of his NHL experience. And then last year he just took off. I mean, the more he played, the better he seemed to get. We come to find out now he played like the last 2 months of the season with broken ribs. The kid is a leader. He's a natural leader. I think offensively, that 40-point range, 50-point range, that's where he was last year, is probably what his ceiling might be. But boy, can he defend. He can play in every situation. And when Jared Spurgeon got hurt and Jonas Brodin got hurt, it was just more minutes for Faber, and he didn't look out of place. So the Wild got a good one. He was in that Kevin Fiala deal with LA a couple years ago. And Fiala wasn't going to re-sign in Minnesota. So great job by the Wild staff to get a first-round pick and Brock Faber. And Faber looks like he'll be a stud on the blue line for a long time in this league.
Was that a surprise that a long-term contract was given so quick?
Well, it won't kick in until next year when the Wild will have some flexibility. But I don't think so. I mean, I think in this day and age, look, 10 years ago, were guys after 1 year getting 8 sheets? No. Were they getting 6, 7, 8-year contracts? No. But that's the way things are going now. If you think you have a good 24, 22-year-old, 20-year-old player, you lock them up. And in Brock Faber's case, like the market's only going to go up from here. Some of these other guys that are signing around the league are going to drive that market. So a lot of times teams are like, we want to be first, right, in line, because if player B, player C gets $9 million a year, Brock Faber's representation might say, hey, we're worth $9 million a year. So I think 3-4 years from now, that deal could look really good for Minnesota. And again, he's a homegrown kid. He seems like a really, really good kid, like rooted in Minnesota, right? Like talks about going to his grandparents' cabin, their lake house still. You know what I mean? Like he's just a homegrown kid that's not too big. The moment's not too big for him, and his personality's not too big for the moment, if that makes sense. So I think they got a good one. Could be the future captain of the Wild.
I wonder if he has a pretty good relationship with Jake Ottinger, a little bit of a distance in age, but 2 Minnesota kids coming through the system.
Yeah, you'd be, well, maybe you wouldn't be surprised. Like there's so many guys that, either grew up in the area together, played minor hockey against each other, played with each other. And so many guys that train here in the summer now. And you have the Beauty League, which is kind of like that, the greatest beer league ever that plays at Braemar here in Edina, where I live. It's right down the street. I think last night might have been their last night of the summer, but there's always guys from across the NHL coming back to go for a twirl out there and entertain the fans. So a lot of guys train here. They spend their summers here. because of the lakes and the cabin life. And wouldn't be surprised at all if Faber and Andre have crossed paths or are pretty close.
Regions are so fascinating, Joe, not to get off the Wild for a second, but, you look at the Minnesota hotbed of hockey, and obviously the East Coast has that as well. I mean, Dallas is the Jones kids. We have Blake Coleman, coming from Dallas. So it's so fascinating how it's expanded. Austin Matthews in Arizona. But, I talked to Mike Eruzione a couple of weeks ago from the 1980 Olympic team, and I asked him specifically about that Minnesota-Michigan rivalry against the East Coast. And it was kind of interesting that back in those days, in the early 80s, late 70s, it was a big thing. Like, if you were born in that area, you stayed in that area, and you took great pride in that.
Yeah, and the Minnesota hockey model is very unique, Gavin, at the youth level. So again, we live in Edina. There's Eden Prairie, there's Minnetonka, there's Lakeville, right, where Jake Ottinger's from. A town like where Riley Tufte's from, Coon Rapids, I believe. Like, a lot of these associations, you play from mite hockey all the way through high school hockey. And unless you're going to like the development program or a Shattuck St. Mary's, you play with the kids a lot of times from when you're 4 or 5 years old all the way through high school together. That's pretty cool. There's not a ton. There are some, but there's not a ton of club hockey here, right? Where they're travel teams, they're select teams. You can do that in the summer. And yes, there are kids that certainly play, club hockey here. It is sort of growing, but Minnesota has prided itself for years on not having that and just having association hockey. So Brock Faber, for example, grew up in Maple Grove. So he played for what's called OMG, Osseo Maple Grove. And he did that, I'm guessing, from the time he was a mite all the way to the time he was a Bantam until he was essentially, ready to go off development program or then the University of Minnesota. So it's kind of cool how you could play within your township, essentially, from the time you put on skates all the way to the time you try and win a state championship.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, goaltending with the Wild is fascinating to me. Yeah, Philip Gustafson, amazing 2022, but not as good in 23. The Wild have one of the top goaltending prospects in hockey in Jesper Wallstedt. And then we have soon-to-be 40-year-old Marc Andre Fleury, who's not retired yet, sticking around. That's a fascinating kind of trifecta in net going into training camp.
Yeah, if you're putting together, Gavin, the top storylines for the Wild, you don't go very far without getting to the situation in net. There's talk that they could carry 3 goaltenders at times this season. I do expect that to happen. Look at what, Milwaukee and Nashville just went through with Askarov.
Yes.
They signed Yusei Saros. They're telling Askarov, if you're going back to the minors, he says, no, thanks. They trade him. That's not going to happen here with Minnesota and Jesper Wallstedt. He knows his time is coming because Fleury has announced this will be his final season. So Wallstedt will be here full time next year, no matter what. But for this upcoming season, there's a chance he plays some games in Iowa of the American Hockey League. An injury to Fleury or Gustafson. And he got a couple games in the NHL last year. Of course, the debut was down in Dallas, which didn't go so well for the guy they call Wally. But hey, he learned from that. He was better his last couple starts at the end of the year. I'm sure he's had a good summer of getting ready for the NHL. And whether he starts in Iowa, finishes in Iowa, or spends 2/3 of the year here in Minnesota, I think it's certainly a storyline that will play out, that will be sort of ever changing and evolving. And then on the Philip Gustafson front, he's got to be better. He was tied for 3rd in the league in save percentage 2 years ago, and then basically near the bottom of the barrel last year. I think his real actual ability is probably in between, right? But he needs to be in that .905 save percentage range, I believe, for this team to have a chance to make the playoffs. And whatever you get from Fleury, hopefully it's a more consistent year. He was spectacular at times and not as good at others. But if you get 30 games from Marc Andre Fleury, maybe it's 45 from Gustafson and a handful from Wallstedt, and they can give you a solid, at least maybe top 13 goals against and save percentage as a trio, the Wild have a much better chance to get back to the postseason.
So NHL.com came out along with the NHL Network with their best wings in the game, top 20. Yeah. Jason Robertson of the Stars coming in at 5. Wanted to get your thoughts on that because coming in at number 7, Kirill the Thrill And how did you feel about Kirill coming in at number 7? And as far as, I don't want to say a bounce back year, but I would think he'd be one of those players where Wild fans would be exciting to get a healthy Kirill on the ice.
Yeah, that's the biggest. Well, two things with Kaprizov for me is one, a faster start. For whatever reason, the last couple of years, he's just started slow. One goal going into November, like handful of points in the first 10 games. Like, that's not him. Because then he finishes with, darn near 100 every year. So it's like, if he just starts a little bit quicker, there's no reason that he can't be top 5 in the league in scoring. And on the other front, it's the health, right? He's missed somewhat significant time, a week plus 2 weeks time each of the last 2 years with injuries. And that obviously is going to hamper any team when you're losing your best player. But for Kaprizov, if he can stay healthy and he can get off to a better start, there's no reason he can't crack that 100-point barrier again and help propel the Wild to the playoffs. I believe he's one of the most dominant players in the game when he's on. I think the numbers back that up. I think the eye test backs that up with his puck protection and his ability to sort of put the team on his back. But he's going to need some more help this year. He's going to need Matt Zuccarello to have a better year, his longtime line mate. And he's going to have, again, as I started with, back sort of on that intro, Gavin, it's like the Wild are banking. They couldn't make a lot of roster moves this summer. So they're banking on Kaprizov to have a banner year. They're banking on Zuccarello to rebound. They're hoping Ryan Hartman is more consistent. Marcus Foligno needs to stay healthier. And Jared Spurgeon, their captain and top leader, honestly, is a guy that played just 16 games last year. And that was a huge blow to the Wild.
So around the league, I tell people, like, obviously a lot of people want to go to Stars games when the original 6 are in town, or let's say the Pittsburgh Penguins, because they want to see Crosby or Ovechkin, and I get all that. But I say every team has gems. Like, for instance, when the LA Kings come to town, I said, you have to see Anze Kopitar before he retires. This guy is an all-time great that's just not talked about in circles. So when I look at the Minnesota Wild, Joe, one of the guys that I look at that I say, why isn't this person talked about more? Maybe it's because of his youth. But to me, Matt Boldy is putting up great stats, 75 games last year, 69 points, plus 5 on the ice. He's only 23 years old. I mean, that's a really, really good player. Big kid, loves to be around the net. Really, really nice shot. Scored way too many goals against the Stars, but I'm a big Matt Boldy guy.
Yeah, me too. And partly because I got to know him a little bit. I didn't call many of his games in the minors because I was fortunate enough to get a few games with Minnesota, like during the time he made his debut, and those were COVID-shortened seasons, and they were a little funky, but just a really good kid, just a great athlete. Like, his hand-eye coordination is elite. He's an unbelievable golfer. He does his pregame training routine with a tennis ball where he's bouncing the ball off the wall and batting it down. I think the kid could do it with his eyes closed. Like, his hand-eye is elite, and his shot, as you said, is spectacular. He wasn't a factor in the playoffs against the Stars a couple of years ago, and Wild fans are certainly disappointed in that. So was management, and they talked to Boldy about it. And then he got off to a slow start last year. He had just one goal before Dean Evison was relieved of his coaching duties. Then John Hines took over, and Matt Boldy, could not score. He was scoring every night. So he is one of those streaky scorers, like a lot of great goal scorers are, where over a 2-week span, he might score 10 goals and lead the NHL in goals over a 15-game span, or, second in the league and scoring over a month and a half. But it just hasn't been consistent enough. And at times, like the playoffs, when the going gets tough and the checking gets tighter, he hasn't always produced. But I'm with you. Love his game. Great skater. Can really shoot the puck. Great on the power play. And boy, last year when Eriksson centered Boldy and Kaprizov, those 3 guys were maybe the best line in hockey there for a month or so. It was just not enough for the Wild and the secondary scoring department to try and push them into the playoffs. But, you talk about underrated players. Joel Eriksson another one. I don't know that he's selling a ticket around the league as far as flashiness or guys that are, household names. But talk about a guy that every single night brings it with that 200-foot game. I bet you if you went up and down that Stars locker room and asked them who they hate playing against on Minnesota, that guy'd be at the top of the list. And he had a career year last year offensively. So he's starting to round out his offensive game, Eric Sinek is, in addition to just being a pain to play against.
From an outside perspective, I know Stars fans would love your input on this Dallas Stars team. Lose Tanev in the offseason makes sense, goes to Toronto. They pay him long-term. He's from that area. Replace him with Dumba, Ilya Lyubushkin. So my question is where do you see the Stars? And secondary question, how do you see this Central Division playing out? Because before last season, I don't know if many of us said, well, of course, Winnipeg will be a top three.
Yeah, the Jets are always sort of that, like, I never know what to make out of them, right? Like,
agreed.
You know, they're big and physical. They've always seemed to have veteran coaches there, you know, even if it changes from, from bonus to whoever, it's like, but they're just guys that have been there, done that, right? So they seem to sort of have that same identity. They're interesting this year. I don't expect them to make the playoffs, if I'm being honest. I think that the last 2 years, I mean, they almost missed 2 years ago after leading the division for much of the year. They faded a touch a season ago, got in, and then got waxed by Colorado.
Yep.
So I think they take a step back this year. The Jets do. I really thought Nashville was going to be a wild card or a playoff team last year. I really like Andrew Burnett, their head coach. That proved to be true. But as far as Dallas goes, man, they are, I don't think, look, Tanev seemed to fit in great, and that's tough when you end up with him just as a rental. But I like Lyubushkin. I like Dumba. Harley, obviously, I've seen grow and mature from his AHL days. And they've got some horses back there, too. Hakanpää's gone, right?
Yeah, he is. He is. But I will say, Joe, that's really interesting you brought up because a lot of people question the 3-year deal with Lyubushkin. Tell me why you like him.
Well, he hasn't really played on a lot of great teams. And so I think it's hard probably to get a gauge on just how good he is, but he's big. He's got a mean streak to him. As long as I'm not crazy here, I'm pretty sure he doesn't mind mixing it up physically. He's not going to drop the gloves, but I just think guys like that, he could sort of be like a Hakanpää, I would think, as far as that size and stature back there. He's going to be on the PK, I'd imagine. Again, with Dallas, like you're looking, in my opinion, you're rounding out the edge, like rough edges. You're smoothing them over with the Stars. Like the base is there, the core is there. Yeah, some of the guys are getting older, but they're replacing them with a Stankoven,
Maverick
and a Wyatt Johnston, Maverick Bork. Like their farm system is deep. Not all those guys are going to pan out. That's just the way it works. But Dallas and Texas, the NHL, AHL Stars have done a really good job over the years of making sure guys earn it down there and then bringing them up when they're ready. And I think that goes a long way into having long-term success. So for me, it's more, Dallas didn't have to do a whole lot to the core of the roster. It's the bottom six. It's the 5-6 defensemen with Ottinger and net and their ability to score goals and their top-end players. They'll be right there again at the end.
Well, listen, I think curry up awesome. I think you delivered, bud.
I appreciate that. Honestly, I haven't done a whole lot of. It's the summer. I haven't studied up on too many roster moves, so I'm glad you tossed up some softballs to ease me into this thing. And,
don't say softballs. One of the compliments people give me is like, "Hey, you asked such good questions."
Well, you did ask good questions, but put it this way. You reminded me that Dumba's in Dallas now. You know what I mean? Like if you put a bunch of free agents in a blender, I might be like, man, I'm just impressed that I knew that Hakanpää ended up in Toronto.
Yeah.
So my prep starts now as I get into start preparing for these broadcasts. Like, okay, I got to move this player from Florida to Carolina. This guy from Anaheim. You know what I mean? Like, part of me, like July 1st seems like an eternity ago with all the moving and shaking and teams making trades. But there's a lot of great storylines across the NHL this year. I'm really excited for it. The Wild have a ton of potential. If they miss the playoffs, it would certainly be disappointing. It's probably not going to be stunning because, again, they're banking on a lot of guys to bounce back, and that can be a risky proposition. But when you get to this time of year, man, everybody's got hope. And that's why I love it. You got kids trying to make the team out of camp that are great stories. It's just coaching changes. Like there's just a ton around the league to be excited about,
Yeah.
I think. And so many good young players. Like you talk about, like, who do you buy a ticket for? Like we still have the McKinnons and the McCarrs, and they're in the prime of their career. And then you have all these young kids. Dallas has a few of them.
Yeah.
That are just so much fun to watch. Like I really enjoyed watching Wyatt Johnston a couple years ago. And I think I was higher on him than a lot of people were. Just nationally, like I expected him to have the year that he did last year. I really did, because of what I saw when he first came up. Like he just seemed like he got it, that he's a difference maker.
Yep.
Those are the guys you want to be that next influx of talent and leadership on your team.
Well, you don't like the opponent when you come to town, but when we get together, It does seem like you like the Metroplex. I mean, you're kind of like you were kind of like an honorary Texan for your years in Houston.
Gavin, do they have cold beer? I mean, if they have cold beer, I can figure it out.
The Frosties do flow well near the stadium, and we do enjoy a couple together.
And I will tell you what, after 5 years in Houston, I don't miss the weather, as you and I have probably talked about. But I swear, yesterday in the Twin Cities, I woke up, I went outside, and I'm like, is this Houston? Because it was that humid, that muggy. Hence, probably why we got pounded with storms.
No, you're absolutely right. One of our big Spits and Suds listeners, and I'll leave on this, David Kokis, he always asks really, really good questions, and we go back and forth. And one of the things he was asking about was, hey, could you do a show on quality road trips for Stars fans? So I think it's kind of a good idea to spend a couple of minutes. But while I have you, a guy that visits every NHL city, what's a favorite Joe O'Donnell destination?
So I get asked this a lot, right? Because I am on the road with the team and have been for a couple of years. You have to remember, I spent like 15 years almost in the American League.
Yep.
And more time, in years prior to that in the ECHL. So I was coming from the Rockfords of the world. So any city in the NHL, for the most part, I'm going to say is a good one. The hotels are really nice. The accommodations are great. Flying charter is a blessing compared to the bus rides. But I will, and that's not too much of a knock on Rockford, by the way. I had some fun in Rockford in my days. But I would say, like, if you're looking for a rink, like you want to be like the arena is important to you. Detroit is amazing. Little Caesars is just an amazing setup. Edmonton, it's not a great broadcast vantage point, but just a building where you're like, whoa. If you're looking for just fun, obviously Nashville, Vegas, like I'd probably give you a 10. Tampa's a great rink. So I kind of look at it as like, the rink, the broadcast vantage point, the city, the press box meal, like all those things factor into a broadcaster's impression of what's a good spot. I think if whoever you said the listener was, like, he needs to prioritize, like, am I going for the opponent? Am I going for the nightlife? Am I going for like an arena I need to see? And that to me would help narrow it down. The other thing is too, I had some buddies that are maybe playing in like Toronto, Montreal, right? Because the Wild have a back-to-back there. So like you can sometimes knock out a Philly, DC, where you knock out two Eastern Conference teams on a back-to-back. You can drive between them, or a New York, Philly, you know what I mean? Like where you can kind of bang out two games at once, get your money's worth. So that's another consideration too. It's just the logistics of getting in and out, or maybe seeing two games for on your trip.
I actually told him that a hidden gem is Tampa and Florida, because inevitably the schedule makers will put that. So you're going to be able to see two games in 3 nights. If you're lucky enough, and Joe, you'll know this team, if you're driving down, maybe in that middle off day, the Florida Everblades are playing, so you can watch them play. And the best part is you can drive from, usually it's Tampa to Florida, and you go through the Florida Everglades, so you can stop. They have some docks that you can take pictures and hopefully not, get eaten by snakes and gators, but it's a good time.
And the other thing is, if you're going during football season, like we were there a couple of years ago, and the Buccaneers were playing Monday Night Football, and we had a day off, and a lot of our guys went. So you might be able to bang out an NFL game sandwiched around some hockey. So, Tampa's arena is great. Amalie Arena, great vibe, great atmosphere. I mean, that's the other thing, too. Like, if you just go see a game in Canada, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, I mean, all those Canadian cities just give you such an atmosphere. the national anthems alone, the sold out crowds,
Right.
like that's something else too. That if you're going from a sporting, to cross it off the bucket list, like if you went to a Maple Leafs game and then swung through MSG,
Yep.
like you're gonna knock out two iconic cities as far as their sports and their arenas go.
It's tough not to enjoy one. I really enjoyed my time in St. Louis. Loved going to San Jose. You can walk back and forth to the game. That's what a lot of Sharks fans do. So I thought that was really cool. Vegas was an amazing atmosphere. So tough to go wrong. Well, sir,
Yeah.
the Maple Leaf Pub in downtown Houston, they miss you.
Well, I miss them as well. I mean, you can't nothing better than a hockey bar in Houston.
If anyone is ever in Houston, it's the most unique place. It's called the Maple Leaf Pub. It's in downtown Houston, and they serve all Canadian beers. They have Hockey Night in Canada on during the season, and it's just really cool that for some random reason, there's a hockey bar that has stayed around for a long, long time, and it's in downtown Houston.
And I know it's still open because just last week, Gavin, Rich Bocchini, our good buddy, sent me a photo from there. So he must have been down there doing something. And,
nice.
And I clicked on the photo and I zoomed in. I was like, oh my gosh, I haven't been there in a minute. So kind of cool. So it is still running down there. Houston's only hockey bar.
Joe O'Donnell, your voice of the Minnesota Wild. Thank you so much for the Behind Enemy Lines preview. Always great to get your thoughts on the Stars as well. Look forward to grabbing Frosty with you when you come to town.
Thanks, Gavin.
Always appreciate Joe O'Donnell joining us. We'll have more guests coming up as we continue to preview the Central Division right here on Spits and Suds. Have a great day, everyone.